Sarah Martinez had never imagined that her morning jog through Riverside Park would lead her into the middle of a firefight. The 32-year-old paramedic was completing her usual 3-mile route when the first gunshots echoed across the tree line. Her training kicked in immediately, and instead of running away from danger like every instinct told her to do, she found herself moving toward the sound. The morning mist still clung to the ground as Sarah approached the old maintenance building near the park's eastern edge. What she discovered there would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in the small town of Cedar Falls. 3 park rangers were pinned down behind their vehicles, surrounded by what appeared to be a well-organized group of armed individuals. The rangers' radio crackled with desperate calls for backup that seemed to go unanswered. Officer Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old ranger with barely 2 years on the job, was bleeding from a shoulder wound. His partner, Maria Santos, was trying to keep pressure on the wound while simultaneously returning fire. The 3rd ranger, veteran Dan Wheeler, was coordinating their defense while speaking urgently into his radio. Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice as he repeated their location and situation to what seemed like an empty frequency. The armed group had them completely surrounded, using the dense forest and scattered buildings to their advantage. Sarah counted at least 8 shooters, though she suspected there were more hidden in the shadows. These weren't random criminals or poachers. Their movements were too coordinated, their positions too strategic. Someone had planned this attack carefully. As Sarah crouched behind a large oak tree, trying to assess the situation, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the attackers was setting up what looked like explosives near the Rangers' vehicles. If those charges went off, the 3 officers wouldn't have any cover left. She had to do something, but what could one person do against so many armed attackers? Her medical bag was still slung across her shoulder from her jog. Sarah always carried basic supplies, a habit from her days working emergency response in the city. She had bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, and her radio. The radio might be their only hope of getting real help, but first, she needed to get close enough to help the wounded ranger. The smoke from the attacker's position was getting thicker. Sarah realized they were using some kind of smoke grenades or flares to obscure their movements. It was a military-style tactic that confirmed her suspicion that these weren't ordinary criminals. The coordination, the equipment, the strategic positioning, everything pointed to a group with serious training and resources. Sarah made her decision. She couldn't just watch 3 people die when she had the skills to help. Moving as quietly as possible, she began to circle around toward the ranger's position. The thick morning mist and increasing smoke provided some cover, but she knew she was taking an enormous risk. One wrong step, one snapped twig, and she could become another casualty. The sound of gunfire continued to echo through the park as Sarah moved closer. She could hear Jake groaning in pain and Maria's voice as she tried to keep him conscious and alert. Dan was still calling for backup, but Sarah could tell from his tone that help wasn't coming anytime soon. Whatever was happening here, the attackers had planned for it well. As she reached a position about 30 yards from the Rangers, Sarah got her first clear look at their attackers. The men and women moving through the smoke were dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying professional-grade weapons. This wasn't a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much more serious, and the 3 park rangers had somehow stumbled into the middle of it. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make her move. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't abandon 3 people who needed her help. The smoke was getting thicker, the gunfire more intense, and time was running out. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to her quiet life as a small-town paramedic. The radio in her bag crackled with static as she prepared to sprint toward the ranger's position. In a few seconds, she would either save 3 lives or become the 4th casualty in what was clearly a much larger and more dangerous situation than anyone had realized. The morning that had started with a peaceful jog was about to become the most dangerous day of her life. But Sarah Martinez had never backed down from challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. With her medical training, Her quick thinking and a determination that surprised even her, she was about to change the course of events in ways that no one could have predicted. The Sarah's sprint across the open ground felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only 10 seconds. Bullets whined past her head as she dove behind the Ranger's makeshift barricade, her medical bag clutched tightly against her chest. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but she was alive and in position to help. "Who the hell are you?" Dan Wheeler shouted over the gunfire, his weathered face showing a mixture of surprise and relief. His radio had gone silent, and Sarah could see the desperation in his eyes. They were truly on their own out here. "Sarah Martinez, paramedic," she replied quickly, already moving toward Jake's position. The young Ranger was pale and losing blood fast from his shoulder wound. "I heard the shooting and came to help." Maria Santos looked up from where she was crouched next to Jake, her uniform torn and dirt streaked across her face. "Thank God you're here. I've been trying to keep pressure on this wound, but I don't know what I'm doing. The bleeding won't stop." Sarah immediately took over Jake's care, her training taking precedence over the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing major arteries but creating significant tissue damage. She worked quickly to clean and dress the wound properly, all while bullets continued to pepper their position. "Can you walk?" she asked Jake, who nodded weakly. "Good. We need to move. They're setting up explosives." Dan's head snapped around. "What explosives?" "I saw one of them placing charges near your vehicles. We have maybe 5 minutes before they blow our cover to pieces." Sarah finished securing Jake's bandage and helped Maria get him to his feet. The veteran Ranger cursed under his breath. 23 years of law enforcement, and he'd never faced anything like this. "My radio's been jammed for the past 10 minutes. Whoever these people are, they came prepared." Sarah pulled out her own radio, a more powerful unit she used for emergency response coordination. "Try this frequency. It's encrypted and operates on a different band than standard Park Service radios." As Dan worked with the radio, Sarah studied their attackers' positions. The smoke was definitely tactical cover, and the way they moved suggested military or paramilitary training. But what were they doing in Cedar Falls? The small town was hardly a strategic target, and the park contained nothing more valuable than hiking trails and a small lake. "I've got something," Dan said suddenly. "County Sheriff's Department is responding, but they're at least 20 minutes out. There's a chemical spill on the main highway that's blocked all the direct routes." 20 minutes is too long," Maria said, helping Jake stay upright. "These guys aren't going to wait around for backup to arrive." Sarah was thinking the same thing. Their attackers were clearly working to a timeline, and whatever they were planning wouldn't wait for law enforcement to arrive. She needed to understand what was really happening here. "Dan, what were you doing when this started? Were you investigating something specific?" The older Ranger hesitated for a moment, then decided they were past the point of keeping secrets. "We got a tip about illegal dumping near the old mine shaft. Someone's been bringing trucks through here at night, dumping something in the sealed tunnels." "What kind of something?" "Chemical barrels. Industrial waste. Maybe worse." Dan winced as another bullet sparked off the metal near his head. "We were just supposed to document it and call in the state environmental team." Sarah felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Illegal dumping was serious, but it usually didn't involve armed resistance. Unless what they were dumping was more dangerous than simple industrial waste. Her emergency response training had included courses on hazardous materials, and she knew that some chemicals were valuable enough to kill for. "The mine shaft," she said suddenly. "How far is it from here?" "About half a mile north through the trees." Maria looked confused. "Why?" "Because I think our attackers are trying to finish whatever they were doing there before you stumbled across them. They're not here to kill us specifically. We're just witnesses they need to eliminate." The distinction was important. If Sarah was right, the attackers would be focused on completing their mission and escaping, not on a prolonged firefight. That gave the Rangers and her some advantage if they could figure out how to use it. Jake, despite his wound and blood loss, was still thinking clearly. The old access road runs right past the mine. If they have trucks, that's the only way in or out with heavy equipment. Can we reach it without going through their position? Sarah asked. Den nodded slowly. There's a maintenance trail that loops around through the heavy timber. It's rough going, but it would get us there. Then that's what we do. We circle around, document what they're doing, and get that evidence to the authorities. Even if something happens to us, they'll have what they need to stop this operation. Maria looked at Sarah with new respect. You're talking about abandoning our defensive position to go after armed attackers. That's either really brave or really crazy. Probably both, Sarah admitted. But sitting here waiting for them to blow us up isn't much of a plan either. The explosions that rocked their position 30 seconds later proved her point. The charges the attackers had placed didn't destroy their vehicles completely, but they created enough chaos and smoke to allow the armed group to advance. Sarah and the three Rangers had perhaps 2 minutes before their position would be overrun. "Move!" Dan shouted, and the four of them began a desperate retreat through the trees. Sarah helped Maria support Jake, while Dan provided covering fire to buy them precious seconds. As they disappeared into the forest, Sarah caught a glimpse of their attackers advancing through the smoke. They moved with military precision, covering each other's movement and communicating through hand signals. These weren't desperate criminals. They were professionals completing a job. But Sarah Martinez had become more than just an unfortunate witness. She was now the one person who might be able to stop whatever was happening in those mine tunnels, and she was determined to see it through, no matter how dangerous it became. The real battle was just beginning, and Sarah was about to discover that the morning's events were part of something much larger and more sinister than anyone had imagined. That smoke was about to clear, and when it did, everything would be different. The maintenance trail through the dense timber proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. Jake's condition was deteriorating despite Sarah's field treatment, and the sound of their pursuers crashing through the underbrush behind them was growing louder. Sarah's lungs burned as she helped Maria support the wounded ranger, but she pushed forward, driven by a growing certainty that they were dealing with something far worse than illegal dumping. After 30 minutes of difficult hiking, they reached a ridge overlooking the old mine complex. What Sarah saw through the trees made her stomach drop. Below them, a sophisticated operation was in progress. 3 large trucks were positioned near the mine entrance, and workers in full hazmat suits were carefully moving sealed containers down into the tunnels. "Jesus Christ," Dan whispered, studying the scene through his binoculars. "Those aren't chemical waste barrels. Look at the markings." Sarah took the binoculars and focused on the containers. The symbols printed on their sides made her blood run cold. Radioactive trefoil signs, biohazard warnings, and numbers that, to her trained eye, indicated extremely dangerous materials. This wasn't just illegal dumping. This was the disposal of materials that could kill thousands of people if they ever leaked into the water supply. "We need to document this and get out of here," Maria said urgently. "If they're dumping radioactive waste, the whole town could be in danger." But Sarah was studying the operation more carefully, and what she saw confused her. Wait, look at how they're handling those containers. They're not dumping them. They're placing them very carefully. And see those cables running from the mine entrance? Dan adjusted his position to get a better view. "You're right. They're wiring something down there." "Not wiring," Sarah said, her emergency response training suddenly providing clarity. "Those are detonation cables. They're not hiding this stuff. They're planning to blow up the mine and bury it permanently." The implications hit all 4 of them at once. If the mine was destroyed while those materials were inside, the explosion could scatter radioactive and biological contaminants across the entire region. The morning breeze was already carrying a chemical smell from the mine entrance, and Sarah realized they might already be exposed to whatever was being stored down there. Jake, despite his weakening condition, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "We can't let them detonate that mine. Even if we die trying to stop them, we have to try." There's 4 of us against at least a dozen armed professionals, Maria pointed out. What can we possibly do? Sarah was already formulating a plan. Her years of emergency response work had taught her to think quickly under pressure, and she could see possibilities that the others might miss. We don't have to fight them directly. We just have to disrupt their operation long enough for real backup to arrive. Ow, Dan asked. The trucks. They can't complete their mission without transportation, and they can't risk leaving evidence behind. If we can disable their vehicles, they'll have to choose between escaping and finishing their work. The trucks are right in the middle of their operation, Maria objected. We'd never get close enough. Not together, Sarah agreed. But one person, moving carefully, might be able to reach them during the confusion we're about to create. She outlined her plan quickly. Dan would use his radio to contact emergency services and provide detailed information about the location and nature of the threat. Maria would help Jake get to a safe distance while providing sniper fire to distract the attackers. And Sarah would circle around to approach the trucks from the blind side of the operation. That's suicide, Dan said flatly. You don't have any tactical training. No, but I have something they don't expect, medical knowledge. I know exactly which chemicals down there are dangerous. And, more importantly, I know how to make some of them much more dangerous if I need to. The look in Sarah's eyes made it clear that she wasn't going to be talked out of this. She'd seen too much and understood too well what was at stake. If these materials were detonated in an uncontrolled explosion, the contamination could spread for hundreds of miles depending on wind conditions. Give me 15 minutes to get into position, she told them. When you hear my signal, 3 quick radio bursts start your distraction. No matter what happens to me, make sure the authorities know what's really down there. As Sarah prepared to move out, she caught Maria looking at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Why are you doing this? You could have just run away when the shooting started. Sarah paused, considering the question. Because sometimes running away isn't really an option. Sometimes you find yourself in a situation where other people's lives depend on what you do next, and you just have to step up. She checked her medical supplies one more time, making sure she had everything she might need for what she was planning. Her knowledge of emergency medicine was about to become a weapon, and she prayed it would be enough. The descent toward the mine complex was nerve-wracking. Sarah moved from tree to tree, using every bit of cover available. The workers in hazmat suits were completely focused on their task, but the armed guards were professional and alert. She counted 8 security personnel, plus at least 6 workers handling the dangerous materials. As she got closer, Sarah could see more details of the operation. The containers weren't just being placed randomly in the mine. They were being arranged in a specific pattern around what looked like a much larger central device. Her blood ran cold as she realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just illegal disposal. Someone was building a dirty bomb in the old mine, using the tunnels as both a construction site and a potential blast chamber. The morning's events weren't about covering up illegal dumping. They were about protecting a terrorist operation that could kill thousands of people. Sarah's radio crackled with static as she prepared to send her signal. In a few minutes, she would either save her town or die trying. But as she studied the complex operation below her, she began to realize that the scope of the threat was much larger than she'd imagined, and the people behind it were more dangerous than she'd ever dreamed. The next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the safety of everyone she'd ever cared about. And Sarah Martinez was absolutely determined not to let them down. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she keyed her radio 3 times, sending the agreed signal to Dan and Maria. Almost immediately, she heard gunfire erupting from the ridge above as the Rangers began their distraction. The security team's attention snapped toward the sound, and several of them began moving to investigate. This was her chance. Sarah sprinted from her hiding spot toward the nearest truck, her medical bag bouncing against her hip. The workers in hazmat suits were shouting to each other in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European accents, adding another disturbing layer to an already terrifying situation. She reached the first truck without being detected and immediately went to work. Her plan was simple, but dangerous. Use the emergency medical supplies in her kit to create a chemical reaction that would disable the vehicle's engines. The thermite compound she could make from aluminum powder and iron oxide would burn hot enough to melt engine blocks, but it would also create toxic fumes and potentially explosive conditions. As she worked under the hood of the truck, Sarah could hear the security team organizing a response to the Rangers' harassment fire. Their leader, a tall man with military bearing, was shouting orders in accented English. Find them and eliminate them quickly. We are behind schedule. Behind schedule for what? Sarah wondered as she moved to the second truck. Whatever they were planning, it was time-sensitive. That suggested a specific target or deadline that she needed to understand. The second truck was more challenging because it was closer to the mine entrance where the workers were still moving containers. Sarah had to time her movements carefully, waiting for the hazmat-suited figures to disappear into the tunnels before she could approach the vehicle. As she worked, she caught fragments of conversation from inside the mine. The workers were discussing timing and placement, and Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. They weren't just building a dirty bomb. They were preparing to transport it. The mine was apparently just a staging area. Final assembly in 30 minutes, one voice called out. Transport team will arrive at 1400 hours. 2 o'clock. Sarah checked her watch. It was already past 1. Whatever they were planning, it was happening soon, and she was running out of time to stop it. She finished sabotaging the second truck's engine and was moving toward the third when a hand grabbed her shoulder. Sarah spun around to find herself face-to-face with one of the security guards, a compact man with cold eyes and a professional demeanor. American woman, he said in accented English, raising his weapon. You should not be here. Sarah's mind raced. She was caught, but she still had her medical supplies and her knowledge of chemistry. Wait, she said, raising her hands. I'm a doctor. If you're working with dangerous materials, you might need medical assistance. The guard hesitated, which was exactly what Sarah hoped for. She could see uncertainty in his eyes. Killing an unarmed medical professional was different from shooting at law enforcement officers. What materials? He asked suspiciously. Radioactive isotopes. Chemical weapons components. I can see the warning symbols from here. Sarah gestured toward the mine entrance. Those things can kill you just as easily as they kill your targets. It was a calculated risk, but Sarah was betting that not everyone involved in this operation was fully briefed on the dangers they were handling. Her assumption proved correct when she saw genuine concern cross the guard's face. You know about this? He asked. I'm an emergency response specialist. I've dealt with hazmat situations before. Sarah slowly reached for her medical bag. If someone gets exposed, you'll need proper treatment protocols. The guard's radio crackled with urgent chatter. The ranger's distraction fire was intensifying, and his colleagues were calling for assistance. He was torn between dealing with Sarah and responding to the tactical situation. Sarah made her move. Instead of reaching for medical supplies, she grabbed a small canister of pepper spray from her emergency kit and discharged it directly into the guard's face. As he stumbled backward, gasping and clawing at his eyes, she struck him with the heavy radio from her bag, and he collapsed. But the altercation had been loud enough to attract attention. Shouts were coming from the mine entrance as more security personnel realized there was an intruder in their midst. Sarah had perhaps 60 seconds before they organized a proper search. She sprinted toward the third truck, abandoning stealth for speed. As she reached the vehicle, she could hear boots pounding on the ground behind her. There was no time for careful sabotage. She needed something faster and more destructive. Sarah pulled out an emergency oxygen tank from her medical supplies and used the guard's weapon to rupture it near the truck's fuel tank. The resulting explosion wasn't large, but it was spectacular enough to cause chaos throughout the operation site. Workers in hazmat suits were running for cover as burning fuel spread across the ground. Security personnel were shouting contradictory orders, torn between pursuing Sarah and protecting their primary mission. And from the mine entrance came an ominous sound, alarms indicating that something had gone wrong with their carefully planned operation. Sarah used the chaos to her advantage, moving quickly from cover to cover as she tried to reach a position where she could observe the mine entrance. She needed to understand exactly what they were assembling down there and how close they were to completion. What she saw made her realize that her sabotage efforts, while successful, might not be enough. Through the smoke and confusion, workers were still moving a large metal container toward a waiting vehicle. Not one the truck she'd damaged, but a smaller, more sophisticated transport that had apparently arrived during the firefight. The device they were loading was roughly the size of a large suitcase, but Sarah could see the care with which it was being handled. This wasn't just radioactive material. This was a completed weapon, ready for deployment. Her radio crackled with Dan's voice. "Sarah, County Sheriff's Department is finally en route. ETA 8 minutes. Can you hold your position?" 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours. The transport vehicle was already starting to move, carrying its deadly cargo away from the mine site. In a few minutes, it would disappear into the network of back roads around Cedar Falls, and Sarah might never get another chance to stop it. She made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to escape or wait for backup, she began following the transport vehicle on foot, using the forest trails she'd learned during years of hiking in the area. It was probably a suicide mission, but she couldn't let that weapon disappear into the world. As she ran through the trees, dodging bullets from the remaining security personnel, Sarah realized that she'd stumbled into something much bigger than a local crime. This was an international terrorist operation, and somehow a small-town paramedic had become the only person in position to stop it. The transport vehicle was getting away, but Sarah wasn't giving up. She had one more desperate plan, and if it worked, she might just save thousands of lives. If it failed, she probably wouldn't live to regret it. Sarah's pursuit of the transport vehicle led her through terrain she knew better than anyone else in Cedar Falls. Years of hiking and emergency response calls had given her an intimate knowledge of every trail, every shortcut, and every hidden path through the forest. She was betting her life that this knowledge would be enough to intercept the terrorists before they reached the main highway. The vehicle was following the old logging road that wound through the valley, but Sarah knew a steep hiking trail that cut directly across the hills. If she could maintain her pace and didn't break her neck on the treacherous descent, she might reach the highway junction before the transport arrived. Her lungs burned and her legs ached as she crashed through the underbrush, but Sarah pushed herself harder than she'd ever pushed before. Behind her, she could hear the sound of helicopter rotors. Apparently, the county sheriff's department had called in state police air support. But they were focused on the mine site, not the escaping weapon. The trail Sarah was following led to an old stone bridge that crossed a narrow ravine about half a mile from the highway. The bridge was barely wide enough for one vehicle, and it was the only way across the ravine for miles in either direction. If she could reach it first, she might have a chance to stop the transport. As she ran, Sarah's mind was already working on a plan. Her remaining medical supplies included several emergency items that could be used in unconventional ways. The idea forming in her head was dangerous and probably illegal, but stopping a terrorist weapon trumped normal legal considerations. She reached the bridge with only minutes to spare. The sound of the approaching vehicle was already echoing up from the valley below. Sarah quickly set to work, using her emergency road flares and some basic chemistry to create a barrier across the bridge. It wouldn't stop the vehicle permanently, but it would force the occupants to get out and investigate. The transport vehicle appeared around the bend below, moving carefully along the narrow mountain road. Sarah could see two figures in the front seats, and she assumed there were probably more in the back with a weapon. They would be armed and dangerous, but they would also be focused on protecting their cargo rather than engaging in a prolonged firefight. As the vehicle approached the bridge, it slowed and then stopped. Sarah watched from her hiding spot among the rocks as the passenger door opened, and a man emerged, carrying an assault rifle. He approached the flare barrier cautiously, speaking into a radio in what sounded like Russian. This was Sarah's moment. She emerged from the rocks above the bridge, her hands raised but her voice strong and clear. "Stop right there. I'm a federal emergency response specialist, and this area is under quarantine due to radiological contamination." It was a complete bluff, but Sarah was counting on the fact that the terrorists wouldn't know exactly which government agencies might be involved in the response to their operation. Her confident tone and official-sounding language caused the gunman to hesitate. "You are lying," he called back, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Check your radiation detector," Sarah replied. "Your weapon has been leaking during transport. You've all been exposed." This was partly true. Radioactive materials often did leak during transport, especially when handled by people who weren't trained nuclear engineers. And she could see from a man's body language that he was genuinely concerned about radiation exposure. The driver got out of the vehicle now, also armed but clearly agitated. The two men conferred in rapid Russian, and Sarah could see them checking some kind of detection equipment. Whatever readings they were getting seemed to support her claims about contamination. Sarah pressed her advantage. "The area is surrounded by federal agents with radiation monitoring equipment. Your only chance is to surrender the device and submit to medical evaluation." More helicopter sounds were approaching, though Sarah knew they were probably just additional sheriff's department units responding to the mine site. But the terrorists couldn't be sure of that, and the psychological pressure was clearly affecting their decision-making. The driver raised his rifle towards Sarah, but his partner grabbed his arm and spoke urgently. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They were debating whether to eliminate her or try to escape. The debate was settled by the appearance of actual federal agents emerging from the forest on both sides of the bridge. Sarah's radio communications from the mine site had apparently been intercepted by state authorities, who had contacted federal emergency response teams. The cavalry had finally arrived, and they were properly equipped to deal with both the terrorists and their radioactive weapon. "Federal agents, drop your weapons and move away from the vehicle." The two terrorists found themselves outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to run and no way to complete their mission. After a tense 30-second standoff, they laid down their weapons and stepped away from the transport vehicle. As federal agents secured the scene and began the delicate process of containing the radioactive device, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse against a tree. Her desperate gambit had worked, but she was physically and emotionally exhausted from the most intense few hours of her life. EMTs arrived to check her for radiation exposure and treat the various cuts and bruises she'd accumulated during her pursuit through the forest. As they worked, Sarah could see the larger operation unfolding around her. The mine site had been secured, and hazmat teams were beginning the process of safely removing the dangerous materials that had been stored there. Dan Wheeler appeared at her side, his arm in a sling, but his weathered face showing relief and admiration. "Jake's going to be fine," he reported. Maria stayed with him until the medical helicopter arrived. "They're both asking about you. What about the rest of the operation?" Sarah asked. "There had to be more people involved than just what we saw." "FBI is taking over now," Dan replied. "Looks like this was part of a larger network, possibly connected to several other incidents around the country. You stumbling onto their operation probably prevented a major terrorist attack." As the afternoon sun began to cut through the smoke that still hung over the forest, Sarah reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a few hours. She'd started the day as a small-town paramedic going for a peaceful jog. Now she was being debriefed by federal agents as a key witness in a major terrorism investigation. The media would eventually label her a hero, though Sarah never felt comfortable with that description. To her, she'd simply done what anyone with her training and knowledge should have done when faced with an impossible situation. She'd used every skill she possessed and taken calculated risks to protect her community. But as she watched the last of the dangerous materials being carefully removed from the mine site, Sarah knew that her quiet life in Cedar Falls was over. Federal agents were already discussing witness protection and the possibility that other terrorist cells might target her for her role in disrupting their operation. The smoke was finally clearing from the forest, revealing the scope of what had almost happened in her peaceful hometown. And as Sarah Martinez emerged from those dissipating clouds of smoke and chaos, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. The Rangers had called for help when they found themselves surrounded by enemies everywhere. And when the smoke cleared, she had been the help that emerged, not because she was a trained soldier or federal agent, but because she was a person who couldn't walk away when others needed her. It wasn't the ending to her morning jog that Sarah had expected, but it was exactly the kind of response that her community needed. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Sarah Martinez had never imagined that her morning jog through Riverside Park would lead her into the middle of a firefight. The 32-year-old paramedic was completing her usual 3-mile route when the first gunshots echoed across the tree line. Her training kicked in immediately, and instead of running away from danger like every instinct told her to do, she found herself moving toward the sound. The morning mist still clung to the ground as Sarah approached the old maintenance building near the park's eastern edge. What she discovered there would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in the small town of Cedar Falls. 3 park rangers were pinned down behind their vehicles, surrounded by what appeared to be a well-organized group of armed individuals. The rangers' radio crackled with desperate calls for backup that seemed to go unanswered. Officer Jake Thompson, a 28-year-old ranger with barely 2 years on the job, was bleeding from a shoulder wound. His partner, Maria Santos, was trying to keep pressure on the wound while simultaneously returning fire. The 3rd ranger, veteran Dan Wheeler, was coordinating their defense while speaking urgently into his radio. Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice as he repeated their location and situation to what seemed like an empty frequency. The armed group had them completely surrounded, using the dense forest and scattered buildings to their advantage. Sarah counted at least 8 shooters, though she suspected there were more hidden in the shadows. These weren't random criminals or poachers. Their movements were too coordinated, their positions too strategic. Someone had planned this attack carefully. As Sarah crouched behind a large oak tree, trying to assess the situation, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the attackers was setting up what looked like explosives near the Rangers' vehicles. If those charges went off, the 3 officers wouldn't have any cover left. She had to do something, but what could one person do against so many armed attackers? Her medical bag was still slung across her shoulder from her jog. Sarah always carried basic supplies, a habit from her days working emergency response in the city. She had bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, and her radio. The radio might be their only hope of getting real help, but first, she needed to get close enough to help the wounded ranger. The smoke from the attacker's position was getting thicker. Sarah realized they were using some kind of smoke grenades or flares to obscure their movements. It was a military-style tactic that confirmed her suspicion that these weren't ordinary criminals. The coordination, the equipment, the strategic positioning, everything pointed to a group with serious training and resources. Sarah made her decision. She couldn't just watch 3 people die when she had the skills to help. Moving as quietly as possible, she began to circle around toward the ranger's position. The thick morning mist and increasing smoke provided some cover, but she knew she was taking an enormous risk. One wrong step, one snapped twig, and she could become another casualty. The sound of gunfire continued to echo through the park as Sarah moved closer. She could hear Jake groaning in pain, and Maria's voice as she tried to keep him conscious and alert. Dan was still calling for backup, but Sarah could tell from his tone that help wasn't coming anytime soon. Whatever was happening here, the attackers had planned for it well. As she reached a position about 30 yards from the Rangers, Sarah got her first clear look at their attackers. The men and women moving through the smoke were dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying professional-grade weapons. This wasn't a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much more serious, and the 3 park rangers had somehow stumbled into the middle of it. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make her move. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't abandon 3 people who needed her help. The smoke was getting thicker, the gunfire more intense, and time was running out. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to her quiet life as a small-town paramedic. The radio in her bag crackled with static as she prepared to sprint toward the ranger's position. In a few seconds, she would either save 3 lives or become the 4th casualty in what was clearly a much larger and more dangerous situation than anyone had realized. The morning that had started with a peaceful jog was about to become the most dangerous day of her life. But Sarah Martinez had never backed down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. With her medical training, her quick thinking, and a determination that surprised even her, she was about to change the course of events in ways that no one could have predicted. The smoke was about to clear, and when it did, everything would be different.